Thank you. Well, for those of you who've been to China, the first thing you notice as soon as you land at the airport, particularly in Beijing, is the air pollution there. China, in fact, has the claim to 20 of the 30 most polluted cities in the world, last time I checked. And there are some serious health issues associated with the air pollution there. An estimated 750,000 premature deaths per year, as well as 75 million asthma attacks. Most of the pollution in China that we think of is coming from factories as well as industrial facilities. But a lesser known source of air pollution is indoor air pollution coming from stoves, which is in fact the 4th largest cause of mortality in China. And a lot of this air pollution is causing acid rain, which falls on about 1/3 of the country and costs an estimated 30 billion yuan per year in crop damage. And air quality overall has an estimated welfare cost to China's total GDP of somewhere between 3% and 8%. And that's just air. Turning to water, 2/3 of China's cities have difficulty accessing water. Approximately 70% of water in most cities is not suitable for drinking or fishing. And an estimated 20% of China's water supply is actually lost through inefficiencies in the distribution system, with northern China really seeing the brunt of the water problems. China faces challenges related to land degradation and desertification, which is increasing. And really at the center of many of China's environmental challenges is its reliance on coal. Despite stringent environmental regulations throughout the country, many of these are not being met. And in particular, when you look at regulations to capture pollution from coal power plants, at times of energy shortage, which is frequently, there's an energy penalty associated with running this equipment, and therefore a real disincentive to follow regulations, even if they're really quite good. And this is compounded by the fact that energy-intensive industries throughout the country are actually increasing as a share of China's economy, despite efforts to transition to a more service-based economy. And more recently, China has become the largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world, and climate change really being one of China's biggest environmental challenges of the future. So what I plan to talk about today, I'm going to look a bit at China's contribution to climate change as we understand it today. Look as well at how climate change is likely to affect China in the coming decades, and whether the leadership there should be paying attention to this and concerned about it. But I'm also going to focus on what China's done so far to reduce its emissions trajectory, as well as to promote clean energy, and its success there is quite notable. And finally, I'm going to talk about why I think it's particularly in the interest of the United States to cooperate with China to promote clean energy and to address climate change. So if we look at where most greenhouse gas emissions are coming from around the world today, you can see from this map, the darker colors, the red and the blue, are the countries that on an annual basis are contributing to the majority of greenhouse gas emissions. Zooming in on China, you can see that it's the eastern part of China, right? This is where most of the emissions are coming from, where most of the industry is based, where most of the economic growth is taking place. China is now the largest emitter of carbon dioxide emissions globally, responsible for about 1/4 of annual emissions. But of course, if we look at a per capita basis, so emissions per person, the average person in China emits roughly 1/4 the emissions of someone here in the United States. And the average person in China, I should mention, is still emitting roughly double that of a person in India. And then it's also important to look at the historic context for these emissions, because from a scientific perspective, annual emissions only give us a little piece of the puzzle. When we look at carbon dioxide and its impact on warming, carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for roughly a century or more. So what we really care about is the buildup of gases over the last 100 years or so. And you can see historically, for the last 100 years, comparing the United States and China, for example, It's really the United States that was emitting the majority of gases in the earlier part of this century, and China, it's really just been in the last couple of decades where you've seen this spike and increase in emissions. But of course, when we look at China and we think about greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, what we're really worried about is where China might be going. And this chart shows one projection that was put up by the Department of Energy in the United States of where China's emissions might be in 2030. And you can see that their emissions are just expected to continue on this upward trajectory and take off in the next couple of decades. Now, I should mention that our ability to estimate China's greenhouse gas emissions have been notoriously inaccurate in the past, and much of this has to do with our understanding of what is driving these emissions in China, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. But if you look at these emissions in some perspective, China is expected to be at roughly 400% above where they were in 1990 by the year 2030. I used 1990. This was a baseline that was adopted, some of you may remember, in conjunction with the Kyoto Protocol target, which was taken by many developed countries. In total, the Annex I countries to the Kyoto Protocol, many of the world's developed countries agreed to these targets to reduce their collective greenhouse gas emissions just over 5% below 1990 levels by 2012. And you can see that with these projections expected by China, that Kyoto target becomes completely insignificant in the face of what we'll be facing from the growth in emissions from China in the coming decades. So what is driving these emissions growth in China? Well, much of this has to do with the fact that China is extremely dependent on coal. This is not going to come as a surprise to many of you. 2/3 of China's energy consumption is driven by coal, and about 80% of electricity generation is coming from coal power plants. And China has been building new coal power plants at a rate that we have never seen before in any other country anywhere else in the world. In 1 year, they put in the coal power capacity equivalent to what's in all of India, several times the amount in all of the United Kingdom, for example, and they surpassed the size of our fleet here in the United States many years ago and haven't looked back. China is, of course, developing many other types of sources of energy for electricity as well. Hydropower is still quite a sizable source, and wind and nuclear are increasingly important sources. But what is somewhat worrisome is that the share of coal in China's electricity generation is actually increasing rather than decreasing, despite the efforts, the very strong efforts really being made to diversify the energy supply in China, to use more renewable energy, to use more nuclear energy and more hydropower. And so when you look into the future of where China's coal consumption is projected to go in the coming decades, and you look around the world and see who else is using coal, the amount of coal that China is expected to burn in the couple of decades, as you can see from this huge green wedge here, is just above and beyond what any other country plans to do in the coming years. So I'm now going to take a look at some indicators across China as we begin to assess the impacts that climate change might have across the country. So this is a map that shows where China's population is distributed around the country, the red dots being where most of the people are. Again, not surprising, most of the people, as we know, are on eastern China, primarily in the coastal regions. But these circles that you see are showing the percentage of the population that is ethnic minorities within China. And you can see you see ethnic minorities concentrated primarily in southwestern and northwestern parts of China. Looking at economic indicators on top of that, the darker green provinces here are where the majority of China's economic growth is taking place, again, very much centered on the eastern coastal parts of China. You see the plants here showing provinces that get at least a quarter of their GDP earning from agriculture still. And the circle showing arable land that is susceptible to droughts and floods at this point. So a lot of China's agriculture is still, very much dispersed around the country, and still a large share of these provinces' economic output. Which brings me to water. Looking at this map, the lighter colored shaded provinces are provinces with less water on a per capita basis, on a per person basis, and the darker colored provinces are, of course, there's less people there and more water. The circles showing the amount of water that was actually used in the provinces, so now taking into account moving water around the country, which China does very frequently and increasingly plans to do so in the coming decades. And the red teardrops you see here, or raindrops, being provinces that have a water deficit. So they're having to import more than they have, and you can see this concentration of the red drops right around the Beijing area. Northern China, extending outside of Beijing, is really one of the most water-scarce regions, and this is expected to become increasingly a problem in the coming years. And finally, I think it's important to think about where China's energy resources, its domestic resources, are located. Water is used for energy, for hydropower, as I mentioned. So you see a lot of hydropower in China in the southwestern parts of the country. But China's coal tends to be concentrated in these darker colored provinces here, the northern, northeastern, northwestern provinces in particular. China spends a lot of energy just moving coal around the country to places that they need it. And a lot of times when you hear about power shortages, it's not that there's not enough power, it's that they can't get the coal to the power plants to generate the power that you need. The yellow circles here are showing you potential hydropower capacity. So again, this is really concentrated in southwest China. But if you remember, most of the economic activity, most of the population is on the eastern coastal part of China, where you don't have a lot of coal, you don't have a lot of hydropower, and you don't have a lot of water. So I look at all these things together, and I see a few areas that I would be concerned about looking forward, particularly in the face of some of the climate impacts that are projected for China. So for example, looking at eastern coastal China, which is really the population center of the country, it's the economic center of the country. It's also a country with a a part of the country with very low elevation. So for example, if we were to see sea level rise up to 1 meter by 2050, which many scientists are predicting, this could submerge an area the size of Portugal along China's eastern coastline. And in fact, most of Shanghai is less than 2 meters above sea level. Northern China, as I mentioned, is extremely water scarce. It's also very dependent on coal. Now, if you envision that we might eventually live in a carbon-constrained world, a world where countries are forced by price signals or international pressure or whatever the situation may be to start to diversify away from coal or particularly the dirtier fossil energy sources, China is very reliant on these sources and doesn't have a ton of other options that they're not already pursuing to, in many ways, their maximum potential. Northern China also still very dependent on agriculture despite the water shortages there, and climate change is expected to exacerbate all of these things. And then finally, looking in southwestern China, in particular the Tibetan Plateau region, relatively low population comparatively, but of course a very large share of ethnic minorities in this part of the country. This is a place where a lot of resources lie. A lot of resources are moved from this part of the country to the east. And of course, when we look at the Himalayan region, where there's many glaciers that feed the rivers that flow not just throughout China, but throughout Asia, this is the water that's driving many of China's dams for hydropower. This is the water that a lot of the agriculture relies on. And many of these glaciers, as we know, are receding at faster rates than were projected even by many of our climate change models. So I guess I see climate change, as many do, as not sort of a new environmental problem for China or the rest of the world to face, but really a threat multiplier. It's going to exacerbate a lot of China's other existing energy security problems, environmental problems, water problems, migration problems, public health problems, and in some ways may threaten the core of its economic growth, and we know how important that is. And because China is so large, anything that is sort of a national impact, as I'm defining it, by default will have regional and potentially global consequences. Now, China is actually doing quite a bit to deal with climate change. It's ratified all of our major international treaties that we have, the United Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Kyoto Protocol, but as a developing country is not yet bound to any sort of emissions reductions under those regimes, although neither are many other countries that perhaps should be. China has also adopted many high-level resolutions and action plans to deal with energy efficiency and renewables, and I'm going to talk about these in a moment. But the point I want to make is that energy is really at the core of China's climate problem, and the way its energy system is structured makes it very hard for it to begin to reduce its emissions in any quick way. One place that China has been extremely successful is in decreasing the energy intensity of its economy. So we've heard about China's really impressive economic growth over the past few decades, and in fact, between 1980 and 2000, China was roughly able to quadruple the size of its economy, but it did this while only doubling the amount of energy that it consumed over this time. And that creates a sharp decline in energy intensity measured as energy per unit of economic output. And this was actually a rate of decline faster than we've ever seen in any other country, any other economy throughout the world. This rate of decline, however, changed in the early part of this decade, where energy intensity started to increase for the first time in a long time, meaning that energy consumption was growing faster than economic growth. And this was really of concern to the Chinese leadership, because they don't want to use more energy than they have to. They're already using a lot. And this is not just an environmental issue, right? This is an economic issue. And so this caused a target to be put in place as part of the 11th five-year plan. This was the last 5 years from 2006 to 2010, to again try to reduce energy intensity of the entire country from 20% over this time period. And they've been relatively successful at doing this. Over the last 5 years, the entire country has been mobilized around meeting this target. And the government is now reporting that they roughly met it, maybe fell a little bit short, and the data are still coming out. But many policies were put in place to try to do this. But why does this matter? Why all this focus on energy intensity? Well, if you envision that China's energy intensity had actually stayed where it was in about 1977, before that sharp decline, which I showed you, China would be using 3 times the amount of energy that they are today. So it's because of these efficiency gains, and partly due to diversification of fuels that they've been able, as well as technological improvements, they've been able to reach this decline. And this was important for them to be able to grow their economy the way that they have. So many programs and policies have been put in place in China to achieve this decline, to improve energy efficiency. I won't go through them in detail, but they've targeted all the top energy consumers. They're doing very detailed audits at the plant level in all the big energy consuming enterprises. The government is providing financing to help companies adopt more efficient energy technologies. The other place where China has been really quite successful is in the area of renewable energy. And it's been going on gradually for the last couple of decades or so, but really started to take off around 2006 when China adopted a national level renewable energy law. This is something that actually very few countries have. They put in place a national system to promote renewables across the country. They have targets for all specific technologies, and they have programs to price and distribute and integrate renewables with the electricity grid. And this has led to several successes. One is in the area of wind energy. So this is for 2009, the picture you're looking at here. You can see that as of 2009, China was roughly number 3, just behind the US and Germany. This is the end of 2009 in terms of total installed wind power capacity in the country. But in that year, 2009, they put in more wind turbines in that year than any other country in the world. In 2010, so we now know just at the end of this past year, China has moved into the #1 position in both of these metrics. So there are more wind turbines now in China than there are in the United States, in Germany, in Denmark, or all the places that we think of as being the early leaders in this technology. And this has really been very much a recent development. You can see here, the dotted line is showing you the share of annual wind power installations around the world that are taking place in China. So you can see that all throughout the 90s, China was almost negligible in the amount of wind energy that was going there on a global basis. But it was really just in the last decade and really just the last 5 years where you saw a doubling of capacity every year for the last 5 years or so. And this is reflected in the industry and where companies are now based, where the technology is being sold, as well as where it's being developed. China is not just deploying wind turbine technology, they are manufacturing it themselves. And they are innovating in this technology and developing new generations of wind turbines, which are going to be used in China and are likely going to be used around the world. So it's somewhat difficult in a place like China to measure innovative activity, because a lot of the metrics are somewhat different than we might use in this country. But if you look, for example, if you take the proxy that as wind turbines get larger and larger, which they have been over the last decade, the technology is getting more and more advanced, and you look at the average size of wind turbines that are being installed in China versus in the other leading wind countries, you can see that the average size of a wind turbine in China has jumped from just about 700 kilowatts about 6 years ago to now well over 1 megawatt. And the standard size for utility scale wind turbines that are being installed around the world is about 1 megawatt or 2 megawatts. If you're getting offshore, you're looking at the sort of 3 to 5 megawatt range. So China is catching up. Another striking thing we've seen within China in the wind energy market is the ownership of the firms and the technology that's being sold there. So just a few years ago, within China, there are many foreign wind turbine manufacturers active there. All of the leading wind companies around the world, Vestas, GE, Gamesa, these are from Europe, from the United States, they have all since moved their factories to China to build wind turbines. And just a few years ago, it was really still primarily foreign companies that were selling the majority of wind turbines in China. Although by 2006, they had pretty much all already shifted their factories to China. If you went back just maybe 3 years earlier, they were all still being imported from Denmark, from Germany, from the United States. But just in the last few years, we've seen a huge shift in where wind turbine sales are going, and an emergence of many, many new wind turbine manufacturers that are Chinese-owned. So in 2006, that 40% market share was comprised of, I would say, primarily one Chinese-owned wind turbine manufacturer, and two would have sold a few. In 2009, you have roughly maybe 40 Chinese-owned companies that are selling commercial scale technology into the market, and about 90 or 100 that have some form of wind turbine technology under development, the prototype stage, various stages of research and development. So China went from having one wind turbine manufacturer to maybe 100 or more in about 5 years. And the size of this market, of course, grew substantially over this time. This is about 13-fold. So while the foreign companies are losing market share, and you'll hear them talk about this quite a bit, the size of the market increased substantially. Now, if we look at solar energy, we actually see a very different story. What is similar about wind and solar, and now I'm talking specifically about solar photovoltaics, the solar panels that we put on our homes, or use for large-scale central station solar power plants. China is also the largest producer, manufacturer of solar panels in the world and the various components that go into making them. But they're not even close to the top 10 in terms of deployers of solar energy, people who use solar energy. And part of the difference between wind and solar has to do with the industrial strategy, but also just the cost of the technology. In many parts of China, as well as in the United States, wind energy is competitive at this point with many other more traditional forms of electricity, whereas solar is usually not, depending on the specific situation where it's being applied. And so the Chinese government has not yet put in place the same infrastructure, policy infrastructure to promote the use of solar domestically as it has for wind energy. This may change because what we're seeing is that many of the leading Chinese solar manufacturers, they're entirely dependent on export markets. They're entirely dependent on subsidies for solar that are in Germany, in Spain, and in California primarily. And if these start to change, or if depending on the economic situation, we've seen China particularly in 2009 in response to the global recession, put in place some very strong policies to promote the use of solar energy domestically. I would argue these were industrial policies. These were an attempt to use the solar that they were producing as opposed to an environmental policy or really an energy policy, although I think that this could change. And the other thing we see China doing is putting in place policies to regulate carbon. I note this because it's sort of interesting to note that China has a national carbon target that they've announced. It's an intensity target, so it's very much modeled after the energy intensity target, which I discussed earlier, in that it's not an absolute target. China's carbon emissions will continue to grow, but they're going to grow constrained with economic growth, and potentially this could still curb the emissions trajectory, which I showed you earlier. And meeting this target is going to depend on how the economy grows, how difficult it's going to be to meet it, but it is, by almost any calculation, going to require quite a bit of improvement, both in continuing to decrease energy intensity, as well as continuing to promote the use of renewables and other low-carbon fuels or nuclear power. Now, I want to turn, for the last few minutes of my presentation, to talk a little bit about the United States and China and how we've been interacting on these issues. And I want to start with a few recent headlines that we saw this past summer, which you may have seen. In mid-July, the International Energy Agency pronounced that China was now the largest energy consumer in the world. And the immediate response we got from China was not, yay, thank you, we're number one. But we don't actually think this is correct. Now, we actually saw very similar reactions from various people in the Statistical Bureau and the government right around 2007 when some researchers in the Netherlands said, oh, China's now the largest emitter of carbon dioxide. I think there's a lot of reasons for this, but part of this just has to do with the challenges with collecting good data within China, particularly on energy and on carbon emissions, as well as a bit of concern about what this now means for China being the largest energy consumer in the world. A couple days later, we saw in Washington, where I am, the Senate pronounced that a climate change bill would not be taken up this year. And that same day, we saw China announce a plan to begin domestic carbon trading. So this is the cap and trade design that we've been talking about for a long time in this country, is in the process of potentially being piloted within China. And we'll probably hear more details about that in coming weeks. We heard later in the summer, China passed Japan to become the second largest economy. Of course, we hear continuing woes throughout the country of US unemployment and economic challenges. Early September, a report comes out naming China the most attractive place to invest in renewable energy in the world by Ernst & Young. We hear about China's investments in renewables being the largest in the world as well. And the next day, the United Steelworkers Union filed what we call a Section 301 petition against China's green technology practices, which led to the US Trade Representative launching a WTO dispute against some of the policies China's had in place over the last few years to promote wind energy development in particular. So I think this highlights sort of where things are and some of the tensions that are really growing between the two countries as relates to clean energy. And this makes it really challenging to cooperate with China. But even in this challenging atmosphere, I'm going to make the argument that it is still in our interest to try to do so. Some of the perceived challenges that we frequently hear talked about, we're competing with China to become a renewable energy technology leader. I don't particularly think that's a useful framing, that of competition. There are things China leads in. They lead in production and manufacturing of some of these technologies. But we are still very far ahead in research and development, as well as in deployment of some of these technologies, although we won't be for long, and particularly not if we don't continue to think strategically about how we want to support these technologies going forward. Of course, you hear a lot this claim that US companies cooperate with Chinese companies. They will steal our technology and our intellectual property. There, of course, are anecdotes of this happening. But there are, for every story of this that you hear, there is an example of a US company that is working in China and benefiting greatly from this partnership. And I will happily point you towards many of these companies that I've spoken to that will tell you this. So then you might think, well, what do they have to learn from us? They seem to be doing a pretty good job of this themselves. But what I haven't mentioned is that although the numbers are high in terms of installed wind power capacity in China, for example, the actual utilization of the electricity coming from these wind farms is quite low. The capacity factors coming out of these wind farms are much lower than they should be. So a wind farm in China is generating much less electricity than a comparable wind farm in similar wind resource regimes, for example, in the United States would be generating. And this is due to several challenges related to, in many ways, just a lack of experience in the industry, poor wind resource measurements, poor technical skills, and particularly in being able to really differentiate a technology which is very good from a technology is poor. And the government is doing a lot to really increase certification practices there. And lastly, that we have nothing to learn from them. Well, China is the only country pursuing gigawatt-scale wind farm development in the world, as I mentioned. If we ever plan to do this, and many people think we may, the challenges they are facing with integrating wind into an electricity grid due to the somewhat unique challenges of a resource which is intermittent is going to be experienced at this point first in China. So this is really a laboratory for us to be testing this technology and to learn from some of the challenges that China is already facing. So I'm about out of time, and I'm going to wrap up. I just want to say, there's a large amount of cooperation programs that have been launched. This is a list, a partial list of the programs that were announced in fall of 2009 when President Hu and President Obama signed a whole new era of cooperation on clean energy and climate change. And one that I think is going to be important to look out for is one called the Clean Energy Research Centers. This is actually a relatively new paradigm in cooperation in that it is setting up laboratories with consortiums from the US, from China. It includes the private sector, academia, national laboratories in both countries around a set of issues where we both have mutual interests. And it's focusing on actual joint innovation of these technologies as opposed to just holding conferences or exchanges or a lot of what tends to take place. So I think that there's a lot of real similar challenges that China and the United States face in dealing with climate change, with energy security, and maintaining economic growth and prosperity. These are all things that we both agree on in many ways, that we are looking at this issue very much in the same way. And I wouldn't say that for all the issues in US-China relations. In many ways, we're sort of already on the same page with a lot of these challenges. And so I would argue this is one of the areas where we can have a conversation with China, where we can work with China, and this can actually improve the relationship in other spheres as well. And lastly, our two countries are really uniquely positioned in many of these technologies we're going to need going forward to lead the world in the development of these technologies and the utilization of these technologies. And in particular, China's ability already to manufacture many of these technologies at scale has made them much more affordable and much more accessible, not just to China, but to all the other developing countries and emerging economies that are going to need them going forward as if we all decide to transition to a more low-carbon energy pathway. So I will stop there. Look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks. That was great. Thanks, Joanna. It was great to get sort of an upbeat piece about the possibility of good Chinese-U.S. relations. So I hope it works out. Before we have question and answers, I think we've got some other food for thought. Okay. We'd now like to open the floor to shorter speeches disguised as questions. Okay, questions. Where are we? Right here. Brewster.
Joanna, thank you very much. I'm Brewster Grace from Rockland. We witnessed a terrible impasse at Cancun, I think, as China and the United States failed to reach agreement on some of the most basic issues of the Kyoto Protocol. So there's no momentum right now, it seems to me, for a future renewal. What do you think accommodations can be made on the part of China and the United States in order to get a renewal of the Kyoto Protocol?
Thank you for the question. I mean, I'm not sure. I guess there's a few ways to think about this. I think that while Cancun might not sort of be the focus of where China and the United States are holding things up, I think actually much agreement was reached in Cancun on many issues which have been being negotiated for quite a long time. But ultimately, everything that's being discussed in the UN Framework Convention and the Kyoto negotiations are not getting us anywhere close to addressing a lot of the challenges I laid out here. And you're right that at the core of this really in many ways it's not so much where China and the United States disagree, I think, as where both countries are really sort of unwilling to take the next step. And I would argue that the United States plays quite a big role in that. But unfortunately, that's not necessarily our negotiators. Part of that's Congress, part of that is just the challenge of our political system. I think that what we're really seeing in both China and the United States is a move towards focus on domestic action. So regardless of what happened in Copenhagen or what happened in Cancun, China had already announced its target, its national target to reduce carbon emissions and has stuck by that. The United States has also announced a target, although it's yet to be enshrined in national regulation the way that China's, I expect, will be when the 12th five-year plan is released. And I think that another thing we're seeing is a real resurgence in bilateral discussions on climate change issues, because in many ways that's where we have to make the progress. That's where we have to come to agreement on many of the tough issues. And I think we can then bring that back to the multilateral process, and hopefully when the political climate is maybe more agreeable to it, push that forward as well.
Tony Grassi from Camden. Can you elaborate on the past and future techniques for the China's use to reduce energy intensity?
Sure. There's a wide range of programs which they've had in place, and I wonder if it would be possible to quickly pull up a slide that I had on earlier that I rushed over. So a couple just that I'd like to highlight that I think were particularly innovative, and this would have been in the last 5 years or so. One was called the Top 1,000 Enterprise Program. So one of China's real challenges is the fact that the country is so large, there's so many players. I mentioned the data is a real challenge. So anytime you set a national target, it's almost impossible to even assess your implementation towards that target without good metrics of where you stand and where things are progressing. So they did something which I think was very smart, which is that they just focused on roughly 1,000 companies, which is a lot, but that's much fewer than there are in China. But these 1,000 companies are about a third of total energy consumption in the entire country. So just focusing there, you can actually look at the facility level. You can look exactly at what the energy use is of each of these facilities. You can benchmark it to international best practices. And this is going to be different depending on what the technology is and what the industry, right? So they've done this very well, and they've put in place financial incentives. They've put in place incentives for local leaders to meet these targets, as opposed to previously where the targets for local leaders were primarily based on output. So if you're concerned about output, you're not concerned so much about saving energy. But if you are now being evaluated on actually how well you can adhere to your targets, that becomes a very different calculation. So that's one example, I think, where they've been particularly successful and where we may see this scaled up in the future.
Okay, we've got one in the balcony, then we'll go to Rockland.
Yeah, William Quintana, University of Maine. Do we know if the Chinese are doing any research on sea-based hydrolyzers? In other words, the conversion of seawater to hydrogen.
I'm sorry, I lost. Where am I looking?
No,
I'm sorry.
Up there on the left, yeah.
Could you ask one more time? I'm sorry.
Yeah, do we know if the Chinese are doing any research on sea-based hydrolyzers, basically devices that convert seawater into hydrogen?
Interesting question. I heard that there's some interesting work happening in Maine on these technologies, potentially on tidal and others as well. Not to my knowledge, but I'm going to admit this is not an area that I follow closely. I wouldn't be surprised if there's various stages of R&D taking place in a wide range of renewable technologies, which we don't tend to hear about until they reach a bit further, closer to a stage of commercialization. But thank you.
Okay, we've got something from out of the Opera House, Rockland this time. Please comment on China's nuclear energy policy and industry.
Great, thank you for the question. I'll just say briefly, what is somewhat surprising about China, we've heard about how it's certainly a nuclear power around the world, but for a country that has such a large nuclear weapons program, it's very rare for them not to have a large nuclear energy program as well. And China uses very small percentage of nuclear energy in its total energy mix compared to what it could. There's a lot of challenges to building up a nuclear program quickly, although China plans to do so. And if you look at the targets that China has for nuclear going out for the next couple of decades, they're extremely impressive. I think we're going to hear even more about this, I would expect, in the next panel as well. I would just say that I think that one thing that's somewhat interesting is a lot of the renewable energy targets which I mentioned, or low carbon energy targets which are being pursued in China, include nuclear within them. So nuclear is thought of in China as very much sort of one of the low carbon technologies which it is going to pursue. And China needs to look at every option that it has if it's going to diversify away from coal. So I think you will see a pretty sizable increase in the coming years, although potentially not quite as ambitious as some of the targets that the government's putting forward.
Okay, Andrew.
Andrew Stanshaw from Spruce Head. I'm curious about something that was on one of the earlier slides, biomass, first of all. Secondly, the use of wood in stoves. How much wood is used? Where does it come from? And what is the effect on desertification and deforestation?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, I didn't go into biomass in any great detail. There have been some very ambitious targets put in place for biomass energy in China, and they also haven't been proceeding quite as rapidly as the government had hoped, particularly some of the more advanced electrification technologies for gasification of wood. There's a few different issues that you seem to mention. There's sort of the rural energy technologies, the urban energy technologies, household level versus central power station level. And you asked about linkages to desertification, deforestation. I mean, China essentially deforested much of the country earlier on, and so now they are reforesting quite rapidly. And so I think that there are some concerns about not just biomass, but ethanol and moving into other, biomass-based fuels in the future because of the land scarcity issues, the agricultural productivity issues. But this is very much along similar discussions taking place in the United States and other countries as well.
Another from the balcony.
Kevin Martin, Acumen Fund Fellow. My question is actually very closely related to that one, and I'm wondering what percentage of China is off-grid, and if you see any practical role for point-of-use renewable energy systems, things like solar-powered lights or solar ovens or small localized grids that run off of agricultural byproducts?
Yes, great question. So you didn't hear me talk much about off-grid renewable energy, and that's because in China, depending on which statistics you look at, I mean, less than 1% of China is not connected to of people in China are not connected to the electric grid. This is very different from looking at a country like India, for example, where I believe it's at least 25% of the country potentially doesn't have access to grid-connected electricity. That said, that's still a lot of people in China, and there are a lot of decentralized renewable energy technologies that have been used in China for a long time, have been manufactured in China. Small hydropower, for example. When we think of hydropower in China, we think of the Three Gorges Dam and these monstrous dams. But there are more small hydropower, small run-of-river turbines in China than anywhere else in the world. Other, more simple technologies like solar hot water heaters, solar ovens, more in China than in the rest of the world combined. So I think that you see some very different issues there, but still a lot of potential to, deploy further technologies. And
We've got time for two more short, quick ones. Chuck, and then we'll take the last one from Belfast or Rockland. Yeah.
Jean Matlack, Rockport. I wonder if you can speak. It's a huge question, but the relationship between the attitudes and opinions and concerns of the people about these issues? I know it's a vast question, but it seems important.
But it's a great short one, too.
Short question, long answer, but I'll be brief. I talked about a wide range of issues, so there's a wide range of attitudes and opinions, of course. But one thing that I think is notable, which I didn't really talk about, is, of course, we don't see an environmental movement in China the same way we saw it emerge in the United States. And part of that is due to a different legal system and different constraints on public participation in the process broadly. But there are a lot of improvements taking place in that area, and I think that that is something. I mean, I think that we look at sort of all these different tensions and causes of instability and challenges that the government is facing in China in keeping things running well. And the environment, I think, is a big question mark for many people. We've heard about how people are getting wealthier. When people get wealthier, they tend to start to notice things like that their air is dirty and their water is dirty. And it's going to be really interesting to see how urban China in particular responds to the continued state of environmental degradation that they're living with on a daily basis. And I think, one other thing that China is able to do that is harder for other countries is plan centrally large-scale energy projects at scale, whether they be coal plants or wind farms. So that is one reason we're seeing the amount of wind energy that we're seeing. Many of the wind farms going in China are actually places where there aren't a lot of people, but there's excellent wind resources in the deserts, et cetera. But China also has huge plans for offshore wind energy development, larger than any other country in the world. And we know we've been talking a lot about doing offshore here. There's a lot of discussion, but a lot of opposition. But this is something that of course, you don't necessarily get to hear coming out of China, but it'll be interesting to see if that potentially changes in the coming years.
And the last one from Belfast or Rockland. Rockland. Is China at the cutting edge of efforts to overcome the technical problems associated with carbon sequestration?
Great question, because I didn't get to talk about that. I don't know particularly what form of carbon sequestration the person is asking about, but I'll take the liberty and assume that one of the biggest challenges China's going to have is sequestering carbon associated with coal. I mentioned that 80% of China's power sector is coming from coal-powered electricity, and there's a lot of discussion lately about whether we can be capturing the carbon emissions coming from these power plants, sequestering it, and whether this would then allow China to continue to burn coal into the future and still deal with climate change as well as some of the other environmental challenges that come from this. China is, I would say, farther ahead than most in most of these technologies. And it depends, you can get into the details of sort of which technology and which model of power plant we're looking at. But one thing that China's doing that few countries around the world are doing is already starting to demonstrate these technologies. It's not only expensive to demonstrate these projects, but there are all sorts of challenging hurdles that one must overcome, bringing different industry groups together with different expertise, expertise in the power sector, expertise from the oil and chemical sector. And so far, we've seen some very interesting projects. One, for example, is Green Gen, but one of China's largest energy companies, Huaneng, which is a integrated gasification combined cycle power plant, one of the more efficient power plant technologies, which will also, in the next stage, be capturing and sequestering the emissions. So I think what we see is a lot of the leading US power companies, for example, are in China talking to Chinese power plant operators. They want in on these projects. They want to learn from them. They want to understand how these technologies work so that we can potentially look at them here in the United States as well.
Thank you very much, Joanna. It was
Thank you.
very enlightening.